I'm not quite sure. Maybe it's too much bother.
Yeah, come on, big man, don't give up.
Why don't you go for the two Scottish electricity companies share offer?
Well, I'm a very busy man.
Come on, Brucey, baby. Register now for Scottish Power and Hydroelectric and you'll qualify for incentives.
I'm a wee bit short.
But you can pay in 3 instalments. And as a customer, you only need as little as £100 for the first instalment in your local company. I must lose weight.
I'm off to phone right away.
To qualify for incentives, register for a prospectus. Phone 041-414-1414.
I don't know if you can see the changes that have come over me. In these last few days, I've been afraid that I might drift away. Well, I've been telling old stories, singing songs that make me think about where I came from. And that's the reason why I seem so far away today. Let me tell you that I love you, that I think about you all the time. Caledonia, you're calling me, and now I'm going home. If I should become a stranger, know that it would make me more than sad. Caledonia's been everything I've ever had. Caledonia's been everything I've ever had.
The famous Scots author Robert Louis Stevenson. Was it Scottish cheddar that inspired his Dr. Jekyll character? And Scottish mature cheddar, his Mr. Hyde? No, it was because he'd run out. One great cheddar, two completely different characters.
For themselves, they wanted the universities kept out of the devolution scheme. In the 1990s, opinion, I think, has hardened, and they're much more willing to have devolution apply to themselves as well as to everybody else.
Dispatches has pulled all 8 of Scotland's university principals. 1 declined to answer, but of the rest, 5 now favour the creation of a Scottish Parliament. 1 favours full independence, and only 1 wants to see the status quo maintained.
The Labour Party 18 know that real power, real influence, real decision-making will lie in the Westminster Parliament. I believe, Mr Martin, that Scotland has had enough of being a prisoner of conscience within the Westminster parliamentary structure.
This is the former Royal High School in Edinburgh, a building once intended to house Scotland's Parliament. Now, the nearest it comes to parliamentary activity is when the Scottish Grand Committee, consisting of all Scots MPs, moves up here for a formal debate.
Scots live every day with the practical consequences of the present constitutional absurdity. More and more people ask why the honourable member for Galloway and Upper Nithsdale is Secretary of State when almost no one votes for him.
We've paid a high price. We've had the poll tax, the most hated tax in living memory, forced down our throats by a band of zealots who've been rejected again and again at the ballot box.
For the Home Rule campaigners who gathered outside, the Grand Committee is a potent symbol of their powerlessness. Some support independence, others devolution. Amongst those, Canon Kenyon Wright.
Well, I think the Scottish Grand Committee, as we see it, is in fact both a warning and a promise. It's a warning because here are the elected representatives of the Scottish people with absolutely no power. They can vote 5 to 1, 6 to 1 against something and still it can be imposed on the Scottish people. So it's a kind of warning. Whereas the Scottish Parliament, which will one day soon meet in this building, will have power to change things. And it's a promise for that same reason. It's a promise because the plans of the Constitutional Convention have been set out clearly. They are well worked out and they are the attainable way, the way forward if the Scottish people really want change.
This week, ICM for Dispatches and the Scotsman newspaper polled a control sample of 980 adults in Scotland. Compared with the last general election, the Labour vote is unchanged at 42%, the SNP vote doubles to 28%, the Conservatives are down 6 to 18%, and the Liberal Democrats drop 6 to 11%. Applied to seats, the results are even more dramatic. Extrapolating from the last general election on a constituency-by-constituency basis, the Conservatives would be reduced from their present 9 MPs to only 4. Both Scottish Secretary Ian Lang and Health Minister Michael Forsyth would lose their seats. The poll also shows that 76% of the population favour a constitutional change, but that within that there has been a significant swing since the last ICM poll in January. Support for a Scottish Parliament within the UK is up from 27 to 41%, while those favouring outright independence have dropped from 50 to 36. A survey of the top social class showed over 78% in favour of change. Of those, 47% favoured a devolved Parliament and 31% favoured independence. The results make it clear. The UK could face a serious constitutional crisis. In fact, the British government already faces a rebellion.
We're all in this together. We're representing millions of non-payers and a poll tax.
The introduction of the poll tax to Scotland 1 year before England has reaped a bitter harvest of resentment and resistance. The latest figures show that with only a few weeks of the year to go, nearly half of Scotland's poll tax remains unpaid, and not one sale of defaulters' possessions has been successfully completed.
It's interdict is to stop me and every single one of you from being here today. As far as we're concerned.
Last Friday, that defiance of a court order forbidding disruption of a warrant sale saw Tommy Sheridan sent to jail for 6 months. Sheridan is standing for Parliament and will conduct his campaign from inside his cell.
Just would you let me finish, please? Don't be so rude.
As far as I'm concerned, I'm expressing my views here as a member of this staff, and I do not want to be talked in political terms from you or anyone else.
But there have been other revolts too, as in this primary school.
This is not a political meeting, it is purely informational. These people were asked to come along and give you, as parents, their opinions on primary testing so that you can go home and make up your own mind what you want to do about it. It is not political.
Whereas in England and Wales, parents took their objections to compulsory primary tests little further, in Scotland, a major campaign of civil disobedience saw 2/3 of parents defy the government and withdraw their children from the tests.
And I think if I was a parent here tonight, and anywhere in Scotland, I would be sending a paper in to withdraw my child from the national test, because I do not believe for 1 minute that will help my child in his educational career. Thank you.
At this meeting, the sole champion of the government's new tests was a beleaguered Scottish Conservative, Gordon Lind.
The 5 to 14 curriculum is Scotland's national curriculum. Scotland's, not England's, or Britain's, Scotland's. Our very own independent model. And I would suggest that primary testing could equally well be labelled assessment of the national curriculum.
The people of Scotland feel very strongly about this. They feel like really that, in many meetings I've spoken to throughout Scotland, that this is a situation which they have not been consulted on. There is no consensus in relation to this, and it's being imposed upon them. And they see it also moving away from things and moving more into an English dimension. And they feel that is alien to the way that Scottish education has been moving over all these years. And they do not really want to be a part of it.
But now Conservatives face another rebellion. In public, their defence of the Union is unwavering, but they know that behind the scenes the Scottish establishment is increasingly sceptical. Last week, Scotland's most senior judge, Lord Hope, said what until then would have been unthinkable. In a speech at a private dinner, Hope is reported to have described the original Act of Union as having been reluctantly accepted by frightened men. This time, he said, the full process of open democracy should be followed. He has refused to comment since.
Very unfair that people are...
Until the Act of Union in 1707, this building housed the Scottish Parliament. Now it is home to the High Court.
So it's taken away from the jury
He was giving me 90% of the criminal work that I've done.
Today, the Scottish legal profession conducts its business here while pacing in traditional style the length of a hall where once Scotland's government conducted its debates.
The nearest thing you've got is the English case of the wedding photographer who doesn't turn up. And
Scots law has remained different since the Act of Union. But now that difference is under more strain than ever.
I represent, when I go abroad in Europe, a separate legal jurisdiction without a government, which means if I go to a conference which is for lawyers, I get a seat at the table. If independence were to come, putting aside how that can be achieved constitutionally, the Scottish legal system would simply carry on without really blinking. The criminal system, as I've said, is entirely separate from any other jurisdiction, and the civil system, insofar as it runs itself short of the House of Lords and saved from UK statutes, is equally up and ready to go. It goes.
Scotland's legal establishment fears that Scots law is being anglicised by Westminster's habit of tacking changes in Scots legislation to the end of English bills.
It's gradually being eroded by the United Kingdom statutory law, which is imposing itself throughout the Union, by Westminster. Inevitably, employment law, revenue law, transport, planning, these are all national things, and they invariably eat into the common law of the land by... It's unavoidable, really.
Would it be fair to say that amongst the Scottish legal establishment, the concerns which we're seeing manifested elsewhere in politics and so on are also reflected?
Yes, I think that's fair. But it's to do with the fact that Westminster does not seem to be particularly interested in Scotland, rather than any feeling of second-class citizenry or anything like that. We would like to feel, and should be, I think, entitled to feel, that there's more involvement in Scottish affairs by the Westminster Parliament than seems to be the case. And the legal system is a good example.
These men are making an official video for the Church of Scotland.
Our own day, those millions of ordinary people
It's a good shot. Yes, I think they're very effective. Yes, yes.
And set up governments.
Does the wall come down here? Yeah, well, that's very effective against the screen, isn't it?
They are preaching a gospel of self-rule which draws inspiration from the revolt against repression in Eastern Europe.
But Scotland too has its own barriers to freedom. Not everyone feels they have the power to shape their own lives, especially if you're poor and unemployed through the decline of the old jobs. These feelings of powerlessness have steeled many Scots, from all political parties and from none, who claim the right to a greater say in the government of Scotland. Someone wants a democratically elected.
Good. I think we want to bring up the convention now.
The convention shots from there. Okay.
And with that pun on Steele, we want David Steele to come in now and say there are two very different traditions of power in Scotland and England, two different approaches to the Constitution.
Some want a democratically elected Scottish Parliament, with powers to shape our own destiny, a view expressed in the Scottish Constitutional Convention.
Important distinction, which again illustrates the different doctrines of sovereignty in England and Scotland, ours lying in the will of the people.
This film is trying to remind Scots, and perhaps a wider audience, that government in Scotland since the 14th century has been a matter of consent. In 1314, Robert the Bruce led the Scots to a remarkable victory over the English at the Battle of Bannockburn, securing Scottish independence. But only 6 years later, in the famous Declaration of Arbroath, the Scots were saying to Bruce that he only ruled with their consent and agreement. If he betrayed them, they would find themselves another king. Part of the frustration in Scotland after the last 12 or 13 years is that policies have been imposed upon Scotland without the clear consent of the majority of the Scottish people.
For the Church of Scotland, complete independence from the state has been a central principle fiercely defended. In 1988, for example, Mrs. Thatcher sought permission to address the General Assembly. To a sceptical audience, she delivered a remarkable sermon on the doctrinal basis of Thatcherism.
I leave you with that earnest hope that may we all come nearer to that other country, whose ways are ways of gentleness, and all her paths are peace.
But afterwards, she had to wait like some recalcitrant schoolchild, while the moderator left her in little doubt that in Scotland, the Church does not kowtow to the state.
Here, however, are two reports just recently published. One called Just Sharing, which is a Christian approach to the distribution of wealth, income, and benefits, and the other... The other is Housing Scotland's People, a report very recently published of an independent inquiry into Scottish housing. And we hope that this will give you a suggestion of the quality of the Church's concern, and that you will...
Today, that concern is expressed in uncompromisingly political terms.
For 7 centuries and more, the pieces in this power game have moved and manoeuvred. The kings have been tamed, the bishops have been removed, and the pawns have taken centre stage. The Kirk itself has asserted its right to decide its own moves. But the British Parliament still asserts its absolute sovereignty over our nation's life. Does this mean, finally, checkmate for the Scottish constitutional tradition? This is no new debate. It's been going on for 700 years. Time and again, we've had to calculate where our interest lies. This time, we don't have to resort to violence, to armed conflict. We're in a democracy. It'll be through rational debate and through looking at the situation as it emerges after the establishment of a Scottish Parliament. So the debate will go on, but what will certainly not go on is the situation where the Scots are ruled without their consent.
Do you think that devolution, some form of assembly, is the slippery slope to independence?
I personally belong to that slippery slope party in the sense that I think we will have to, once we've established a Scottish Parliament, discuss and decide where that Parliament can best exercise its power in the interests of the Scottish people. Can it best exercise its powers in alliance with the Westminster government, or would the interests of the Scottish people be best served by allying the powers of a Scottish Parliament with the powers of the European Parliament and its institutions? That's an open question. We shouldn't be frightened by that question. We can only face it once we have a Scottish Parliament in place and running.
You'd have to look hard for a community more naturally cautious than that backbone of Scottish conservatism, Edinburgh's business and financial establishment. Yet here too the message of devolution is taking root and cracks in the pro-unionist orthodoxy deepening.
Well, Fergus had lunch with investor relations yesterday on the basis that they wanted to find out what questions he was going to throw at John Brown tonight.
Investment Trust Director Robin Angus favours full independence.
I think of Scotland as being a branch of a rather ramshackle old conglomerate called UK plc. It used to work in the old days when UK plc was decentralised and decisions were made in its various parts. But over recent decades, it's become more and more centralised in Westminster, and that is bad for decision-making. What I want to see now is a management buyout of Scotland Limited from UK plc to bring back to Scotland what she hasn't had for most of this century, the ability to make her own decisions in accordance with her own priorities and her own business plan.
Robin Angus is not alone. Sir Ian Noble of merchant bankers Noble and Company.
I have always believed there should be a Scottish Parliament, and I just believed that. But I now increasingly see it as being a very realistic option because I see so many benefits that could emerge from it.
Until now, nobody has tested those claims against an economic model for Scotland. But at Stirling University, economics professor David Bell has just completed a detailed and objective analysis of what an independent Scotland's budget would be. Assuming that the recession ends sooner in Scotland than England, his conclusion is cautiously optimistic.
It certainly no longer seems to be the case that Scotland has been suffering. It's come through this recession almost better than any other part of the UK. We know what the Union offers. I don't think there's much risk attached to that. But there is a possibility that the Scottish economy might grow faster. I'm saying it's a possibility. I'm not saying that I attach a high probability to it. But there is a possibility that it would grow faster if it were independent.
Bell shows that by 1994, receipts from income tax will rise by nearly £1 billion.
The tax question is a very interesting one. Everyone has assumed that in Scotland there's a higher public expenditure than in England, but I gather all the evidence is very hard to pin down at the end of the day. It's not at all clear-cut that Scotland is subsidised. Perhaps London is subsidised even more. But in any case, what is interesting is that it seems to me quite clear that at the end of the day, tax rates will be lower in Scotland than in England for this reason, that if tax rates are lower in Scotland than in England, the actual receipts of the Scottish Exchequer will be greater.
Low taxes are desperately important because, like every Scot, I want to see better health care, better social services, better education, and the only way to get these things is to have higher tax receipts. And the only way to get higher tax receipts is to have lower tax rates. So you encourage business and you encourage enterprise.
The other main consideration is oil. Bell calculates that oil revenues will initially drop by £1 billion a year, but then in 1994 be restored to present levels.
Oil is declining in certain sectors of the North Sea, but in fact gas is coming up and taking its place. The oil price has been weak in recent months, but everyone expects some kind of recovery in the oil price between now and the end of the century. So the medium-term outlook is not too bad for oil revenues.
But would Scotland get the oil?
Well, that's a different question again. Scotland would get a pretty large share of the oil, but it would probably be determined on equidistance from nearest point on the mainland of both countries. And that would give Scotland about 70–80% of the oil, I think.
Bell's budgets look at the actual amounts received and spent in Scotland last year and then forecast ahead. They show that Scotland would run a budget deficit of more than £5 billion in 1992, which will reduce to £3 billion in 93 and then around £1 billion by 94. That's smaller than occurs now as part of the UK. In the lofty surroundings of Stirling Castle, members of the Conservatives' greatest allies in Scotland, the CBI, are preparing for what promises to be a rather difficult meeting.
There's to look after the Scottish interests, but we must look after that within a UK context. There's no two doubts about that.
First and foremost, Scottish business must be healthy. You can't do all the nice things you want to do in a community unless your wealth generation is there in the first place. Making wealth comes before dividing it up.
Later, they will have to face the press with a united response to the constitutional debate. As they talk over the roast Scottish lamb, it becomes clear that this is going to be no easy task.
And the concern is that any changes, whether they be devolution, independence, etc., don't adversely affect the wealth creators of Scotland, which are the companies of Scotland.
But while the CBI lunches in Stirling, in Edinburgh, another group of businessmen are preparing for their own press conference.
I never thought we'd have to do this. No, I didn't think so.
Here, there is rather less equivocation.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Business Says Yes is a cross-party and non-party group of independent Scottish businessmen and women. We have come together to act as a forum for those who believe, like us, that the establishment of a Scottish Parliament would be good for business in Scotland and good for Scotland.
These are businessmen who have openly broken ranks. They claim that government isn't working, and in particular that Scottish Secretary Ian Lang isn't listening.
My view of Ian Lang is that he's burying his head in the sand. I mean, the man will not address the essential thing of good government of Scotland. When he starts taking an interest, instead of being a messenger boy from London, we may start having a sensible, constructive debate. He does not want debate. He wants dictation from London. It's not good enough.
We're saying there would be real benefits to business in Scotland from the establishment of a parliament here. It would create a government that was in tune with Scottish business and accessible to business in Scotland, give us direct access to Europe, which is something we're missing. We feel we've been sidelined in a lot of issues in the UK. It would create a new sense of vitality and purpose in business in Scotland.
We've had a very interesting meeting of the Scottish Council of CBI.
Meanwhile, back in Stirling, the CBI has agreed a formulation.
I think the conclusion that we have reached is that some change is inevitable and indeed many people feel is desirable.
But making a statement is one thing. Fielding awkward questions is rather more difficult.
Would your preferred option be that the Conservatives adopt some form of constitutional change?
Afterwards, a rather harassed CBI chairman articulated his organisation's dilemma.
I think what we see at the moment is a very rapidly changing scene where the status quo doesn't look all that positive. It doesn't seem as if the status quo is going to be maintained. When 75% and more of the Scottish electorate are asking for some sort of change, it's not up to the CBI to oppose that.
But if the Tory loyalties of the CBI were under strain, the government surely could continue to rely on the support of its friends in the press. Not so. On the 23rd of January, the Sun suffered a sudden Caledonian conversion. All around the country, Tories choked in their porridge as the born-again nationalists of the Sun came near to endorsing republicanism.
It was genuinely done because we believe that it was the way forward for Scotland. As I say, that Scotland's best hope of prosperity, Scotland's best hope of regaining some pride in itself, lay in joining Europe as an independent nation state.
Now we've also got the Belhaven Brewers are bringing out this special draft real ale called St Andrews. Their logo, or the logo on their new beer, is very similar to our own Rise Now and Be a Nation Again logo. Now I think we could strike up a really good promotional deal with them for, buy 2 pints and get 2 free.
We've got some preliminary pictures done.
I don't think there's any question of this being a cynical commercial exercise. Of course, I have heard the charge made, but as I continue to say, we've looked at the issues properly, we've researched it thoroughly, we believe in what we're doing, and we're doing it for that reason, because we think that it is the way forward for Scotland.
I think we'll have to do another reprint of the T-shirts, because I think it's about 14,000. The car stickers are all away, 250,000.
The decision was taken here at this office. In this office, we looked at the issues. In this office, we made the decision. We then obviously consulted with News International senior management in London, as far up as Rupert Murdoch himself. He was absolutely delighted. Mr. Murdoch thought that it was a very, very good idea, and he backed us all the way. But the groundwork and the decision was actually taken here in this office.
Why did he back you?
Because he felt himself, as I understand it, that Scotland would do better on its own, that Scotland had the potential to be a great nation if its freedom was regained.
The cynical might be forgiven for thinking it mattered not so much what Mr. Murdoch felt as where he felt it. On the day that the Sun's English readers were being told,
"The Prime Minister deserves credit for standing by the Union. Scotland derives much more in economic benefits than she contributes in taxes,"
the Scottish Sun was editorialising,
"Mr. Major is wrong when he insists we should stand by the Union. Scotland could only benefit by gaining its freedom."
Well, I think that the fact that the editorials in the English paper sometimes take a dramatically different stance on the Union to ours simply illustrates the reasoning behind what we're doing. It shows the autonomy of our paper up here. It shows that we are a different paper with a different line, catering to different people. It merely illustrates what all this is about.
Jesse Ray.
Jesse Ray,
Roper, yes.
Same as usual, yeah. He's very, very up for Scottish independence. There's a news angle to it as well. On the he's promoting a single for the rugby squad.
Yes.
And there's some good pics there as well.
He always wears this clover, doesn't he?
He will not be photographed without the gear.
Jesse Ray, patriot and pop star, is a success in Scotland, a cult in the black ghettos of New York, yet relatively unknown in England.
The black folk that are very akin to the Scots people in their nature and their sense of humour. And they don't just see me as a typical white soul boy. I'm lucky enough that I can walk a line between the black and white, if you want to call it that. I hate to define it like that, but it just allows me to do a lot of things. Suppression is a major problem with any race at all. And I think one of the things that England will learn is that this interest that they have at the moment in our patriotism and our nationalism. It's not a threat, it's an advantage to them. But the unfortunate thing is it's their own weaknesses that make them afraid of losing Scotland.
Suddenly it seems that hardly a star remains in favour of the Union. Actors ranging from Sean Connery and Elaine C. Smith to Scots comedian Robbie Coltrane have joined the ranks of pop stars like Ricky Ross of Deacon Blue and Pat Kane of Hue and Cry in espousing the cause. Sometimes it seems that the Scots as a whole feel like Jessie Ray. Everyone but the English is interested.
およそ1800年前に作られましたこの壁はスコットランドとイングランドはもともと違う国だと主張するスコットランドの多くの人々の心の拠り所になってきました。
ließ den Norden der britischen Inseln einfach hinter einem Wall verschwinden, den englischen Süden zu schützen.
For centuries, the guns of Edinburgh Castle have pointed south to defend against English domination. The guns may have aged, Scots say. The fear of England has not.
In fact, when these guns were last used, the castle's forces were defending the Union against Jacobites. Today, as the election is called, many Scots are equally stalwart Unionists.
I think that one of the great successes of the Union is that it has strengthened and reinforced the Scottish identity. It's not the sort of union that has obliterated the distinctions between the component parts. Scotland has flourished within the Union in a very particular Scottish way. Scottish institutions of all kinds are well known the world over, but they are well known through the arrangements which the Union has made. Now, the voters of Scotland have more democratic control for the reasons I explained to you, in a sense, over all their institutions as well as over all the institutions of the United Kingdom than voters in England because of the higher proportion of Scottish members of Parliament at Westminster.
The Scottish Grand Committee earlier this week in Edinburgh was a revealing sight. This rump, striving in vain to defend the indefensible, standing like King Canute against the tide of Scottish and European history. If this is really the best they can do, we have nothing to fear but fear itself. Never in the field...
The week, which began with John Major's speech, ended with the 8th meeting of the Scottish Constitutional Convention.
What would be unacceptable would be to try to run the status quo of the Scottish office with retread members from south of the border. There would be an outcry throughout Scotland. The Conservative and Unionist Party would indeed threaten the break-up of the Union.
Supported by the churches, the unions, the Labour and Liberal Democrat parties, the convention is committed to a tax-raising Scottish Parliament within the framework of the Union. For that reason, it is boycotted by the Conservatives and the Nationalists.
I believe we've caught the mood of a new and a confident Scotland. Through the claim of right, we have been both rooted in history and part of a new vision of our nation. The deepest issues we have before us, and I believe the reason why the churches have played a meaningful part in this convention. The deepest issues are not just political or economic. They are profoundly moral and social. They question what kind of people we want to be. They offer us a vision not just of a restored parliament, but of a nation reborn.
Those are noble words, but are they merely rhetoric? Dispatches has put it to the test. We asked Scots whether they would be willing to pay more tax for higher spending on health, education and the poor. 87% of those who wanted some form of constitutional change said yes. Among those who voted for independence, the figure was even higher. But what of the future? We asked our sample whether they believed that devolution was likely to lead eventually to independence. 55% said yes. Only 29% said no.
I believe very, very firmly myself and I think I am Scottish to the backbone, I believe very firmly in the value of the union of Scotland with the rest of the United Kingdom, and I would very much regret any step that was taken that, whether immediately or after a while, promoted a separation between Scotland and the rest of the United Kingdom.
Do you feel that devolution would inevitably lead to an independent Scotland?
I believe that it would be a continual irritant to any sort of parliament that these unanswered questions that I mentioned existed. There would be a complete imbalance in the arrangements for the United Kingdom as a whole, which is bound to lead to further friction and therefore I think has all the seeds of an unstable arrangement which would either collapse coming back to the present or collapse in favour of separation. I think more likely in favour of separation.
This is the recurrence of a very old debate in Scotland about where our interests as a nation lie. And yes, I'm happy to be on that slippery slope. It may lead to independence if it is the will of the Scottish people. It may not. We're going to calculate where our interests lie, but let's take the next step to some kind of autonomous Scottish Parliament within the UK, and the debate from there will continue.
The decision is for Scotland. The challenge is for Scotland. But the result will affect all of us in every part of the United Kingdom.